had been mobilizing to fight fascism for years and years and years and years. And then the pact came, and all of a sudden she's mobilizing against the imperialist war. And what she told me is that she lost almost all of her contacts, all of the people she was organizing with, communicating with, developing relationships with, just said, well, I can't trust you because you just flip on a dime. And that was the lesson that my mother learned about, I guess she said, mechanistic applications of tactics that become strategy. And so I've taken that lesson to heart. It would seem to me that what's most important to me about Stalin and World War II and the period afterwards is what was it that made the Russian CP separate itself from the working class, become not organically tied in with the working class, such that it became such a fragile institution in the USSR, so that it could be overthrown in the late 80s and early 90s. That's what I'm most interested in. And I'm wondering whether Stalin had, any part of Stalin's history had any impact on what was happening in the late 80s, in the 80s and late 80s. So that's my comment. I'm interested in that.
You want to take a number of questions? You want to answer them one at a time?
I think a number of things.
Okay. Norma? Well, that's what happens when you raise your hand. You want to move? You want me to try somebody else?
Hold on a second. You said that this split that occurred had this very small number of people who wanted to break away, and that they, I guess you meant that this was affiliated with Trotsky. And I wanted, it's the same kind of question I kind of brought up yesterday, which was not what Furr was talking about. He was talking about evidence, and I was talking about ideas. My question is, what do you think separated the people who were separate, who wanted to separate? What was the motive? Since, as Furr said, that all the opposition seems to have come from people who had the same good intentions, by and large. So is there any way to track the ideas that urged them to oppose what was being done? And is it worth it to talk about? Because if it doesn't relate, then forget it, we'll talk about it another time. And along with that, they mentioned yesterday, somebody said something about the Communist Party helping to cause the Rosenberg's conviction, and this just drove me mad. I wondered if you have any comment about that.
Not cause, but betrayed.
Okay, over here. Anybody else?
Okay, so it's got to be three. Go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, I found your remarks really interesting, and I learned a lot from what you guys said. I appreciate this conversation, really, actually.
A little louder.
Okay, I appreciate this conversation. One thing that when I became sort of politicized in the 1960s, it was more influenced by what was going on in China. And at that point, I think a lot of us in the New Left, whatever, had considered the Soviet Union already, a different kind of social system going down a different path, away from socialism and capitalism. But I think the importance of this kind of discussion now, given all the social issues that people are facing all over the planet, is this concerted effort on the part of the powers that be to convince the world that there is no alternative to capitalism, and look back at the Soviet Union, and look at China and so on. And a lot of the same things that they're doing with Stalin, of course, they're doing with Mao as well. And a lot of it's very superficial, and a lot of it is pressuring the intellectuals. It's almost a form of censorship. You have to say something, if you're going to write a political book, a history book about these kinds of issues, you have to say something bad about Stalin and something bad about Mao, and then maybe you'll get your book printed. Otherwise, you might as well hang it up. unless you're, fortunate. But anyway, I think it's really important that the history of these revolutions really be examined. And one thing I would ask then is, you talked a lot about, developing the infrastructure and developing the fighting capacity and all that sort of thing. And so, the Soviet Union under Stalin. But I think it's really important to uphold. My understanding is that there were a lot of really important social policies that, for example, liberated women, both in the Soviet Union and China. Educational systems, breaking down the hold of the peasant, the landlords over the peasantry, and of course, a lot of mistakes involved in that. But I think those parts of socialism, that actually represented social advances for the people. Seems to me those are the kinds of things that I'm not that good about, understanding the Soviet Union. I think I have a little bit better understanding in terms of China, but I think those are the kinds of things that need to be spoken to with people, because they're never mentioned by the other side, right?
Yeah.
Elazar?
Yeah,
And then, let me know when you're all questioned up. Elazar and then Bonnie.
all right. So there's several issues involved here. First of all, the imperialist view of the war, it neglects the Soviet contribution. And the French Academy of Sciences wrote a very excellent history of the Second World War that shows that the Nazi spine was broken by the Soviet Union. And that should be element number one. That is, not criticizing Stalin from an imperialist point of view, not criticizing the Soviet Union from an imperialist point of view. And also there are sloppy left writers who don't understand that Stalin was rooted in the Revolutionary Party, began a revolution, and look for conspiratorial solutions to understanding Stalin. That is also worthless crap, most of it. And, okay, so then what I'm left with is, what do I mean by Stalinism? Not Stalin himself, but using the term as an eponymous structure. And I define it as primarily the accession to the idea of socialism in one country, rather than as a higher stage of economic social development than imperialism, which was already a world system, number one. The attendant concept of that comes out of that is peaceful coexistence with imperialism, which is also tied to, I differentiate between a united front of the working class and a popular front, including bourgeois elements, and particularly Millerandism, that is taking cabinet posts in capitalist governments as supposedly a progressive thing. And also splitting the stages of so-called democratic revolution with the struggle for a proletarian revolution. And such as like South Africa's road to socialism, which to all apparent observers on the ground has led to neo-apartheid, neoliberal austerity, privatization, brutalization, suffering of the masses. Not any nearer going to socialism in any direction whatsoever. So that is what I critique. I don't critique in the way a right wing does, a mass murder. So my criticism, if Stalin did the most draconic things, and we would have ended up with an international revolutionary movement, which wasn't destroyed by Stalinism, in my opinion, and an internationalist position, fine. But to say that the Soviet Union didn't crush the Nazis, the reality is that there was no united front with the Allies. The Allies were looking to destroy the Soviet Union concomitantly with the Soviet Union. They traded with the Nazis all during the war. Lend-Lease didn't arrive in any amounts into the Soviet Union until after Stalingrad. The British got 3 times the Lend-Lease amount at the Soviet Union, who fought 100 times more catastrophic invasion than the British did. So I think you have to, this idea of allies is a false one. And that, I think, was what Gary is alluding to. That is calling the British and U.S. as allies, these imperialists who were ever much wanting to destroy the Soviet Union, as the Nazis were. Actually, the meaning of Munich is go invade the Soviet Union. We're handing goddamn Czechoslovakia, would you stay out of Poland, please? We're stuck with treaties with them. And so I think you could, on a power political basis, defend the Nazi Soviet Union. But I think what's left out is, what would a revolutionary do? Would they let Czechoslovakia be handed over to the Nazis? With the mightiest fortifications on their borders? All of Europe would have risen up in the defense of Czechoslovakia? What would a revolutionary have done? And I don't know. I wasn't in charge of a state. Enough long.
Okay, Bonnie, I'm gonna call myself and then Ron.
Bonnie?
Just to add
A little louder, please.
to add a point to what this man was saying about the achievements of socialism in the Soviet Union, what it did for the people. Complete literacy, for one thing, education for a population that was largely illiterate. And what we call affirmative action, a term coined in the 70s, I think, here in this country, was practiced by Lenin and the Bolsheviks from the very first day they achieved power, in terms of the hundreds, of the over 100 different nationalities who had their own cultures and their own languages and had no written language, and raised them up to the level of the rest of the Soviet people, so that they later in time produced their own authors and literature and became on an equal ground with everyone else in the Soviet Union.
I'm gonna ask a question based pretty much on something that's kind of rumbling around out here. My question is you know, one of the problems with the 20th century world communist movement is there was always a guy. You ever notice that? There was always a guy. There was Mao. Mao was a guy and he was the guy. And then Stalin was a guy and Fidel was a guy. There's always a guy. But there's never an integration, or in my view, there wasn't an integration between the proletariat and state power. If the dictatorship of the proletariat had been implemented as it was described in State and Revolution, the Soviet Union never would have been able to overthrow it. And one of the things that's often not discussed, and I think is key to this question of Stalin, is the question of dialectical materials, which Stalin stated in the short history of the Soviet Union, of the party, was as predictive in social questions, and I can get it off the shelf if you want me to, was as predictive in social questions as biology. So you have a kind of mechanistic absolutism, completism in history, that the results of our processes, the results of our method lead to these conclusions lead to these tasks, and consequently the praxis of the Soviet Union ended up in functioning in such a way that they couldn't survive. They survived 70 years. This was the heart, in my view, the world communist movement that they could not sustain. But we sit here and continually grinding away at Soviet history, getting it finer and finer and finer, while, to me, the big red bear in the room is that they're not here anymore. We're still here trying to figure out what the hell to do, but they're not here. It seems to me, instead of the continued defense and continued valorization and continued question of raising the Soviet Union as an example of world revolution in the 21st century, not even addressing the question of a huge industrial command economy and the possibility of it anymore with the technicalities. It seems to me the results, and maybe this goes to something you were saying, the results of those policies is what's important. The Soviets aren't here anymore. If those policies were so enlightened, if they produced the dictatorship of the proletariat, which Stalin moved away from and called it the government of the whole people, if those policies were so correct, where are the Soviets? I'm done. Anybody else want to? Go ahead, Ron.
I think someone else had that.
Okay, Ron? And then okay, Ron, you're the last one, and then we'll let these guys try to climb up.
Okay. I thought you had a list. I was just going to get on the list.
Speak a little louder, Ron, if you're willing.
I wanted to hone in on a contribution of Stalin that is often overlooked. And it comes out of going back and looking at not innocently, of course, I'm going to present it innocently, the New York Times in October 1944. It's quite a period. You know, you have the Red Army is advancing on the Danube. You know, it's the part of the victory. The victory over Hitler is in sight. And you have in this country, if you don't have allies, of course, you know, under a capitalist regime, allies are often, you know, one step away from falling out. You know, but if you don't have allies, a lot of the intellectuals had tremendous affinity for what was happening in this country, and it was a very different period in the academic world. And so in the middle of all this war news comes an article, Soviet economics stirs debate here. And the journal, under the banner of Marxism, had come out. It's an official Soviet economic journal. And suddenly, what they're saying is the law of value is going to operate now under socialism. And it's something that even within Soviet economics had been roundly trashed. That you could never say that. Whatever reality you had on the ground, you could never say that the law of value would operate under socialism. I think it goes to Bob's point, you know, when he was saying, you know, what is the theory's relationship to workers on the ground? I mean, that's what value production is. It's a self-alienation from your own labor. And the other aspect of it is we have to teach capital in a whole new way. Drop chapter 1 altogether. And there's a lot of tendencies that take that. And you know from my discussion here a few weeks ago that that's a measure of what dialectical materialism, I call it historical materialism, Marxist dialectic, it really is rooted in. And when I raised this at other times, people would kind of give me a blank stare and say, you know, what the heck is all that about? So I actually brought the article, if anybody wants to see it, from the New York Times, 1944, October 1st.
Would you read the headline of it again?
It says, Soviet economics stirs debate here.
Oh.
Subhead is significance of the revision in theory will be discussed by American experts. And it was in the American Economic Review, the premier economic journal in this country, and it was a year-long debate. Paul Baran, Leo Rogan, and Oscar Lang, and Raya Donevskaya over a whole year had debated this question. And I have all the original documents, but this is the New York Times. In the middle of the war, and the Red Army is crossing the Danube.
Thanks, Ron. We're going to give these gentlemen a chance to fire back. Go ahead.
Can we start?
Yeah.
Okay. I think we need to keep things in perspective. You know, when Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union still existed. Nazi Germany did not. That was a tremendous historical achievement. Every Soviet worker had a guaranteed job, guaranteed health care, guaranteed education. Their standard of living may have been a little bit lower than American workers, but their cultural level was much higher. They read more books, saw more plays. There was a subsidized, they could get in to see the Bolshoi Ballet at a subsidized rate. So I think we need to understand the accomplishments of the Soviet Union. There were clear defects. As Marx says, defects are inevitable in the first stage of communism. So I think we need to put that in perspective. And if Stalin had been alive, Yeltsin never would have been able to overthrow the Soviet Union. He would have been lined up. You know, as Stalin said, you know, there are people for whom 4 walls are 3 too many. And probably there are some of those during that period.
And you're going to decide.
So anyway, I'm just saying that if Stalin, I think it is nonsense to describe the collapse, the overthrow of the Soviet Union to Stalin. Something that happened 40 years after his death.
World War II caused it.
Any rate, that's a separate issue. The working class, I think, I was really impressed with the book I listed, Szymanski, on the, Is the Red Flag Flying? Because he gives a much different picture based upon his research among Western Sovietologists that indicates a much different view. And basically, the Soviet working class supported the Bolsheviks throughout the Civil War, the industrialization, and World War II. You know, the Soviet Union could not have survived otherwise. And I think that's really important. And this idea that there was a separation, I think Szymanski gives some material saying, no, there was some real mechanisms whereby workers would be brought into the family. There was an organic relationship to ensure that the working class was represented in the party. And there were mechanisms. Szymanski says that, you know, there were thousands of letters to the editor criticizing every aspect of Soviet life. There are two things that were off limits, namely the leadership of the Communist Party itself and the idea of socialism. It's like you can't very well advocate slavery. Well, I guess you can in the United States, but you know, that's off limits politically too, you know. And you could not advocate capitalism in the Soviet Union. You could not criticize the top leadership, but everything else was open game in terms of what the evidence that Szymanski presents. So I think it's really important to understand the actual, really what was going on in the Soviet Union and understand the actual processes as they were, rather than you know, this caricature we've all been fed about the Soviet Union. And that's why I really appreciate what Fur came in here and say, the first thing is to find out the truth, what actually was going on. So I think that's important. And again, there are a lot of issues that, again, indicate that, yeah, Stalin wasn't right on every point and so forth. He made mistakes, but he learned from every one of them. And I'll turn it over to Gary.
Okay. I'm going to suggest to people, what did Stalin contribute to 1989? Once again, I'm going to suggest, and unfortunately this book is out of print, so you're going to have to go to Amazon.
Go steal it.
What is it?
It's called Heroic Struggle, Bitter Defeat, by a fellow named Bachman Azad. The book was originally written as a political report to the International Commission of the Tudor Party of Iran. To, you know, basically, and it was written in the late 1990s when that party was trying to get a grip on what happened in the Soviet Union. So, and the reason I'm suggesting this book is because it goes precisely to what happened with how did the Stalin period, what were the problems that were facing, say, Stalin in the 1930s or the Soviet planners in the 1930s? How did they resolve those problems? And how did the successful resolution of those problems lead to other problems? That at given points, the comrades may or may not have had sufficient knowledge to try to address. I think the book is very valuable in terms of trying to explain that type of a dynamic. That's all I'm going to say about Stalin contributing to 1989. I'm certain there are a lot of things. I know that he contributed a lot of things to my understanding of strategy and tactics in the United States. For example, there's a book that he wrote called Economics and Social Problems of the USSR. It was one of the last pieces that he wrote in 1952. And there's a chapter in there that talks about, I mean, it was a very interesting chapter because it's a chapter on capitalism and the dynamics of capitalism, the fallout between imperialist powers and stuff. And it starts out by saying, well, there's a whole bunch of comrades that think that we just won the war. We've got Japan, Germany, and Italy on rations. They're never going to rise again, da-da-da. These comrades are wrong. Those countries will take the first chance they get, and they will become a force to be reckoned with. And the comrades that are saying this do not understand the dynamics of how capitalism develops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that book, what he writes in that chapter is so prophetic about what the Japanese and the Germans are going to wind up doing, and explain a lot about what's going on now between the EU, European Union, and the Japanese with their Trans-Pacific project and various other things that are going on. But he also talks about strategically about how do you build a peace movement in the United States. And he was saying that, well, back in the good old days in 1914, it was very simple. It was relatively simple. You had a bunch of comrades who betrayed the line. You build a new international and you overthrow these idiots. Nowadays, we're just on the other side of World War II now, and it's a different ball game. We can't simply have a civil war in each country. We've got to be building movements that are, that are cross-class. And sometimes you'll be able to stop a particular war. Sometimes you'll be able to use an international crisis to lead to the downfall of a particular government. And these kinds of things will be really good. But what all these people in the peace movement have to understand is that in order to get rid of this craziness, you've got to get rid of imperialism itself. He's saying this in '52, about a year before his death, okay? He's not criticizing imperialism. He's saying it's got to go, and comrades don't realize this. Socialism in one country. I think by the end of World War II, when the Soviet Union is faced with the prospects of, we just took over a whole bunch of real estate in Eastern Europe, and now we have to administer it. That socialism in one country is pretty much a dead issue. And whatever Stalinism may have started out with on that, it certainly didn't wind up with that by 1989. You had a block of socialist states, and as to whether or not the CP betrayed the Rosenbergs, I was told some very disturbing news by Eliza before this thing started this morning. That's probably something worth, that basically it took the longest time for the Communist Party to come out in defense of the Rosenbergs from the time of their indictment to the time about after the day after they were sentenced to death or something like that. I don't know the history of that. We have one example of that Eliza talks about from the front page of the Daily Worker. I'd like to see a few more Daily Workers prior to that. That's all.
There is nothing more before April 6, 1951, not one more. In the National Guardian there was.
But in the National Guardian?
The National Guardian group started the Rosenberg trial. And there were individual Communist Party rank and file, just like there was in South Africa, that opposed Zuma, and opposed the new security bill, that it went down the right. It's always